Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's Medicinal Monday on the Alter Your Health podcast. I'm Dr. Susanna.
And I'm Dr. Ben.
And we're both naturopathic doctors that empower individuals to reverse disease and reclaim their optimal health through whole food, plant-based nutrition, and mind-body medicine.
And today is another Medicinal Monday. This is our first pre-recorded Medicinal Monday, so we're not actually live with you. Just have to, put that out there for full transparency. But that being said, we're looking forward to talking about kidneys, your kidney health, and also your urinary tract. Of course, preventing and reversing UTIs and that sort of thing. And this is, sometimes I feel like when people talk about kidneys and urinary tract stuff, it's like that there's not a full understanding of what can actually be done. It's kind of like just kidney disease is just some mysterious thing that maybe nutrition doesn't have that much of a role in creating. But the fact is that it most certainly does. And same is true actually for UTIs. There's kind of course, a lot of different causes for UTIs, but we're going to be talking about some of the most common nutritional and lifestyle causes for urinary tract infections and how to, get out of that cycle of chronic urinary tract issues.
Yes. But yeah, when we start, kind of upstream, when we look at the kidneys, another condition that is commonly discussed is kidney stones.
Yeah.
So we'll
talk about kidney stones, talk about kidney infections, which of course is kind of a more severe UTI that generally ascends, and then chronic kidney disease, which we want to live in a way to prevent that, because that's kind of just a lifestyle thing that progresses with age. If someone's diagnosed with chronic kidney disease, then the goal is to keep that from progressing further to the point of course, needing like dialysis or a kidney transplant or something like that. So chronic kidney disease is really just the decline in kidney function, which is, of course, a laboratory value that can be measured. Your glomerular filtration rates, your GFR, is a measure of kidney function. And as people age, it's kind of, one of those things. It's like cholesterol goes up, blood pressure goes up, kidney function goes down. And all of these things that are quote unquote normal in our society are not actually healthy or normal for our physiology.
Right.
Which kind of conditions should we begin with talking about the kidneys?
Well, you already started kind of introducing kidney disease, chronic kidney disease.
This one's the easiest, I think.
Okay. Let's start with this one. Yeah. And as you said, this is measured with GFR typically in laboratory tests. And yes, this is a condition that gets worse with age. What is the factor that is causing the chronic kidney disease, though? Are our kidneys just designed to break down as we age, or what's actually going on here?
Yeah, well, that's a good question. And the way that I like to think of it is the kidneys are filtering blood. And like with any filter, you can imagine like a mesh filter or strainer that lets liquid through and keeps solid particulates out. And that's what, of course, the kidneys are doing. They're filtering blood, and what comes through is our plasma into the toilet, and all of our proteins and all of the other macromolecules and stuff stays in our body. So we're dumping out some minerals, we're balancing our sodium and electrolyte levels, other kind of waste products, and and compounds and hormones and stuff like that. But that straining mechanism, if we're living a toxic lifestyle, if we've got a lot of toxicity floating around in our bloodstream, and if we're eating a high protein diet, this is where nutrition comes in very powerfully and profoundly. If we've got a lot of blood protein from the high protein diet that we might be eating, then those proteins can kind of put a strain on that mesh filtration system and kind of start to degrade that filter. And what ends up happening is that filter kind of breaks down, and some of those proteins and bigger molecules are dumped into the urine. And that, of course, proteinuria, and you can measure that with the urinary dipstick. That's a sign of too much protein in the urine. Where does that protein come? It comes from our bloodstream. And where does it ultimately come from? It comes from our nutrition, what we're putting into our body. So that's kind of the major number one risk factor for breaking down the kidney filtration system is, nutritionally, lifestyle wise, is our high protein diet. And this is conventional, like common sense in the medical world. Like if someone has kidney disease, it's recommended to lower protein intake, but also to balance our hydration levels, electrolyte levels. Like all of those things are, of course, so important.
Right. Also, a couple other considerations for long-term kidney health. Having healthy blood pressure is super important, because if we have elevated blood pressure, that puts a strain on our most delicate blood vessels in the body. And the kidney is one of the organs that has the tiniest little vessels. So high blood pressure can definitely result in kidney issues, as can high blood sugar, because blood sugar, when it's elevated, is also very inflammatory and damaging to the blood vessels, especially the smallest blood vessels. So that's why diabetes and high blood pressure, unmanaged, uncontrolled, ultimately does lead to kidney disease.
Yeah, and you brought up this idea of those small blood vessels, which we talked about, months ago at this point when we're discussing our circulatory system, the vascular system, and how essential our endothelial function is, the health and function of that thin layer of cells that wraps our blood vessels. So when we're thinking of healing and regenerating and repairing and keeping any organ system healthy, we need to consider the health of our endothelial cells and our endothelial function. And really what that comes down to is living in a low oxidative stress lifestyle. That's why, things like, smoking and, pollution and toxicity, quote unquote, like anything that gets lumped into that like description of toxicities, toxic to the body. Really what toxicity is doing is causing oxidative stress. And the cells that are most vulnerable to that oxidative stress directly are generally those endothelial cells that line our blood vessels. So that oxidative stress can cause kidney disease, of course, especially when accumulated over the course of a lifetime. So of course, we know the opposite of that, the protective measure against oxidative stress is antioxidative rich, phytonutrient rich compounds from our whole plant food. So it's just that kind of balance of high antioxidants, low oxidative stress, leading to that environment that creates healthy kidney function.
Yes, so we can see that whole food plant-based eating optimizes kidney function because it is generally low protein, relatively low protein to our, standard American diet or high meat diets. It is also so helpful in regulating blood pressure, as we talked about in our vasculature what was that episode we did? Cardiovascular episode.
Yeah.
Also so helpful in balancing blood sugar, like we talked about in our pancreas episode where we were talking about blood sugar regulation, and also so helpful in mitigating oxidative damage in our body, right? Having these high phytonutrient foods coming in and quenching free radicals. But also another reason why this whole food, plant-based, relatively low protein diet is so helpful for kidney health is because it also creates a more alkaline environment for the kidneys, which actually is a good segue into talking about kidney stones.
Yeah, and before we go there, you brought up the protein macronutrient. Of course, that's a very important conversation when talking about kidney health. And just to kind of put our minds at ease, we've talked about it before, but we're not talking about becoming protein deficient. We're talking about getting our protein needs, but not excessively, which is what is done with most diets, especially like a standard American diet. Of course, a keto diet or a paleo diet, high protein diets. So really what we're talking about is just like 10 to 15% of our calories coming from protein. Maybe, I've been, delving into more endurance, athletic performance research. And, there's some reason maybe to get like 20% of our protein or 20% of our calories from protein. If we're breaking down muscle a lot, using muscle a lot, needing those muscles to regenerate and grow, like, yeah, 20%. But most people are getting way more than 20% of their calories from protein. So 20% I consider to be kind of like an upper healthy limit for sure. Like if we're very active, 10 to 15% is great if we're not like in the higher activity category. But anyways, just wanted to kind of quantify that conversation around protein real quick.
Right.
But yeah,
Right.
segueing into kidney stones, which is of course a severe acute issue. I'm fortunate to have never experienced this, but I know my mom has, and I know other people who have experienced kidney stones, and I understand it to be excruciating.
Yes. Yes. And, many people, when they think of kidney stones, they think the main issue is their intake of oxalates, dietary oxalates, because most kidney stones are calcium oxalate stones. And so generally what some people are recommended to do are to avoid the high oxalate foods like spinach and chard and beet greens are the three highest greens in oxalates. But it's important to know it's really not the oxalate's fault.
Yeah.
It's actually the environment, the pH level of the kidneys. Is it acidic? Is it alkaline? Because those stones can really only form in an acidic environment.
Yeah. So of course, this brings up the conversation around acid balance and alkalinity balance in the body. And this is a big conversation, but just to kind of like encapsulate it as briefly and concisely as possible. Essentially, our blood pH is very tightly regulated, but it's regulated by buffering systems. So one of those buffering systems is creating and is putting more calcium or allowing more calcium to stay in the bloodstream to create a buffer for acidity. So if we're eating things that are more acid forming, and those acid forming things are just higher protein foods, mainly higher animal protein foods, like those sulfur containing amino acids like methionine and cysteine, they create more acid in the body, creating more sulfuric acid when they're broken down. But also, just junk foods, just processed foods when digested, create acid in the body. So that causes more calcium to kind of stay in the bloodstream. And when calcium gets into the kidneys, one way that calcium can kind of crystallize is by forming calcium oxalate stones. So if we have acidity in the kidneys, the natural calcium that exists there binds onto the natural oxalates that might exist from our diets to create calcium oxalate kidney stones. But that's only in the presence of that acidic environment. In other words, if we have more alkaline environment where our calcium levels are more tightly regulated, and there's not the environment for the calcium to create crystals in the alkaline environment, it's actually impossible to form kidney stones in an alkaline environment because of the chemistry, because of the biochemistry of that environment. So of course, like you said, there's one kind of philosophy or fear-based approach of like, oh, calcium oxalate stones, stay away from oxalates. Now that I'm thinking of it, like, why isn't anyone concerned about calcium? Should we be tightly regulating our calcium intake too? Is it just the oxalate fault? But of course, it's neither calcium or oxalate's fault. It's the acidity fault. So yeah, rather than staying away from oxalates, the way to really prevent, and I don't know about reverse, it's hard to reverse a kidney stone once it's there causing issues, but you just got to kind of pass it for what I know. There are some things to do to manage the pain as in that process. But anyways, the prevention of kidney stones is really a matter of creating that alkaline environment, like you were saying, in the kidney.
Yeah. And so how do we do that? By eating plants. All plant foods, with the exception of whole grains, are completely alkaline forming when we digest them in the body. Even even the acidic foods we think of, like tomatoes and citrus, they're actually alkaline forming when we digest them. Whole grains are just slightly acid forming, but nothing even close to what animal products.
Yeah, and it was just occurring to me that some of the most alkalinizing foods are, of course, our green leafy vegetables. So those oxalate-rich vegetables are actually alkalinizing vegetables. So that's a good thing.
Right.
But if oxalates are like a real fear, it's like, oh, I don't know, I've got this tendency to form calcium oxalate stones. I remember there's like some research comparing the oxalate level in spinach, which is kind of a high oxalate green, versus kale, which is a low oxalate green, excuse me. Spinach has like 1,000 times more oxalates. So if you are afraid of oxalates or want to mitigate oxalate consumption, just choose the lower oxalate veggies like lettuces and kale. And I'm not sure the exact greens, but there's a list of low oxalate greens that you can find.
Right. But it's important to understand, and we see this in the scientific literature, that vegetarians and vegans don't have higher rates of kidney stones. They actually have lower rates, especially those who eat a vegan diet, because eggs and dairy are acid forming.
Yeah.
So yeah. And, of course, those on a vegan diet, we don't know exactly what they're eating in the study, but we can kind of, I don't know, assume that they're eating more vegetables and assume that their oxalate intake is maybe a little higher.
Yeah, I guess if you might do the study in 2022 versus 2002, like 20 years ago, let's face it, there's a lot more vegan junk food that is acidifying to the body than maybe there was, 20 years ago.
It's true.
So
it's true. Yeah. One other thing is that it's interesting that our gut microbiome adapts to the level of oxalates that we consume, and that when we do consume foods that have high amounts of oxalates, we actually upregulate the growth of a bacteria called oxalobacter, which actually breaks down oxalates.
Yeah, and I'm just remembering we did a whole podcast episode on oxalates and lectins and phytates and all these spooky phytonutrients that are in fact health promoting. So you can search for and find and equip yourself with better understanding of these phytonutrients if you want to learn more. So yeah, covered chronic kidney disease, covered kidney stones, more of an acute issue, and then kidney infections kind of segues into urinary tract infections because it's kind of the same thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, a kidney infection is kind of the later stage of a urinary tract infection, right? Because the urinary tract infection works upward, starting in the lower urinary tract, then to the bladder, then it can ascend to the kidneys. And so when we think about how to prevent urinary tract infections, several things come to mind. Of course, the first and most obvious is hydration, right? Anything related to kidney health, we should be thinking about optimizing hydration.
Yeah, and the hydration, exactly. We're talking about chronic kidney disease, talking about kidney stones, talking about kidney infections, talking about urinary tract infections. Hydration is key. And of course, if you've heard us talking about hydration, you know that when we say hydration and use the terminology hydration, we're not just talking about putting water in your body. We're talking about hopefully putting water into your cells. Cellular hydration, which of course requires balancing minerals and getting a lot of our water from foods or mineral-rich, produce, fruits and vegetables, but also mineralizing our hydration sources with trace minerals, as well as maybe some lemon water, herbal teas, and these things like that can help put water properly into our body.
Right. But when we're talking about the urinary tract, it's kind of like, regardless of whether our hydration is really getting into our cells or not, it's important that we're simply moving hydration through our urinary tract. We're just flushing things out, because it's when we get dehydrated when we're more susceptible to developing an infection, because things just slow down. Bacteria can adhere to the walls of the urinary tract and then start to cause issues and inflammation.
Yeah. And of course, that calls into question bacteria. Where's this bacteria coming from? And there's interesting research that points out how, again, nutritionally, people who eat more animal products have an increased risk of developing urinary tract infections. And they have found that the actual bacteria that causes these urinary tract infections are animal-borne bacteria that sometimes can spread from surfaces into our microbiome and disrupt things, but also can spread from our rectum and our, microbiome directly to our urinary tract to disrupt things. So of course, the most common bacteria causing UTI symptoms is E. coli. It's different strains of E. coli. And these E. coli bacteria are generally coming from chicken. That's what has been found. So the chicken bacteria, either from surfaces or from the chicken that we're eating, disrupts our microbiome and causes an overgrowth of E. coli, because we know that E. coli is just a normal, healthy microbe, not pathogenic, but an opportunist, as we might say. And this opportunist can make its way in the urinary tract and overgrow there to cause symptoms. Right. So, of course, when talking about E. coli, common treatment or way to manage that is the cranberry juice thing, the D-mannose, which is, of course, an amino acid that helps to prevent the adherence.
D-mannose is a sugar.
Yeah, that helps to prevent.
Not an amino acid.
Oh, yeah, D-mannose. It helps to prevent the adherence of bacteria onto the urinary tract wall, so it kind of flushes through. But I think, I always have found it funny that, drinking cranberry juice, for sure, cranberry juice is rich in D-mannose, right? That's,
yeah.
And then there's D-mannose just as supplements, but I think we can all agree that drinking fresh cranberry juice, watered down, because it's really powerful, can be really healing. Whether or not there's D-mannose in it, just because of the flushing, hydration, phytonutrient rich, immune boosting compounds. I
forget. Can I interrupt? Because I was distracted by the D-mannose sugar versus amino acid. Did you explain how it specifically helps to prevent the E. coli from attaching to the walls? Oh, you said that. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool.
That's what I was just talking all about. So yeah, regardless, but I was also saying that, sure, maybe it's the D-mannose, but maybe it's also just the flushing mechanism of, a healing fluid that is hydrating us, also providing other phytonutrients to help our immune system. Vitamin C cranberry juice is very rich in vitamin C and other phytonutrients. So anywho, cranberry juice, very common remedy that actually works when the offender is that E. coli strain, which my understanding is 90% of UTIs, maybe more. But sometimes, it's another bacteria, which the D-mannose methodology doesn't really defend against.
Yes. And then there's so many herbs that we can find in tincture form or tea form that also help in the clearing of a lower urinary tract infection. Things maybe you've heard of, like uva ursi and plantain leaf and zea mays, or corn silk, equisetum. The list goes on. And these can definitely be helpful, especially in the early stages of a urinary tract infection.
Which, of course, it's really important to be proactive and kind of sensitive to those early symptoms, so that you can flush it through and prevent it from grab and hold and creating kind of the more frank UTI symptoms. And then when that happens, it's kind of a slippery slope. A lot of people do get looped into the antibiotic treatment and then needing antibiotics to treat it. And then there's antibiotic dependence or resistance, or whatever you want to call it. And then things can progress to kidney infection. So we want to stay on top of it. And most importantly, think curiously about what's causing it, which is, of course, maybe more of a nutritional lifestyle thing.
Definitely.
Anything else?
Anything else?
I mean, there's always the hygiene conversation for women.
You want to wipe front to back, not back to front. You want to pee after sexual intercourse. You want to wear clean underwear, right? You want to, breathable underwear. Cotton underwear is best.
And of course, women, females are more prone to urinary tract infections because of their anatomy. And, it's important to take care of that anatomy, you know? So
I think that it'll be interesting to continue this conversation on the urinary tract on Wednesday when we're talking about the mind-body connection or brain-body connection, because a lot of urinary symptoms can actually stem from some mental patterns, anxious patterns, for example.
yeah,
So
totally.
we'll
Well,
continue our conversation on Wisdom Wednesday.
yeah, hope you learned something, and feel free to leave any comments or feedback if this resonates or if you've got anything to add.
All right, everyone. We'll see you next time.